Hi guys, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, it's great to meet you. I'm Stella and I love making miniatures for my Barbie's dollhouse using mostly cardstock. Today I'll show you how I made a miniature replica of this iconic IKEA cart, and as always, I have a pre-printable template to help you make your own version. You'll find all the infos and the download link in the video, so now let's get started. To begin, I cut all these parts and glued them together, going from the biggest to the smallest and aligning them at the center. And as usual, I suggest using cardstock from old packaging, since it's quite thick but very easy to cut, and it's basically free, which doesn't hurt. Next, I cut these three parts and attached them together, once again starting from the bigger one and ending with the smallest. I ended up with these two elements that I assembled like this. The final piece should be roughly 4mm thick. I repeated the process to make 3 more identical pieces, then I cut these parts and assembled them together this way. Next, I cut these parts and once again I glued them together, going from the biggest to the smallest. I assembled the resulting elements like this. Then I repeated the process to make a second identical piece. At this point, I had all these elements ready. I assembled them like this to make the legs of my miniature IKEA cart. Now, I figured this part might be a little weak, so I strengthened it up by cutting a small strip of toilet paper and wrapping it around the junction line this way. I repeated this step for all 4 joints. Then I cut another strip of toilet paper and I started wrapping it around the entire length of the cart's legs. This has 2 main goals. First is that this will make the whole structure a little sturdier, and the second is that it'll also make the legs appear more rounded and less angular. Next, I covered both legs with a generous layer of acrylic gesso. This helps making the surface more even both in color and texture. To connect the legs, I cut this part 6 times and folded each piece along these lines. And if you're using my free printable template, I suggest using an awl or a large needle to pierce this tiny hole. Next, I press the left and right side of each rectangle against a wet sponge. This makes the cardstock softer and easier to shape, and then I roll them against the handle of a small paintbrush to give them a bit of a rounded shape. Next, I mark the placement of all the rectangles using this template as a guide. Finally, I assemble the legs this way. I covered the little rectangles with acrylic gesso so that they would match the color and texture of the rest of the legs. Then I painted the entire surface of the cart's legs with acrylic paints. To make the trace of a miniature cart, I started by cutting this part twice, and then I glued the 2 sides together this way. And given that the design is quite small and intricate, I switched to a lightweight type of cardstock, as it makes it easier for my cutting machine to achieve clean cuts. And obviously, cutting this by hand is kinda crazy, so if you're using my free printable template, I recommend either cutting a simple plain rectangle like this one, or using a mesh-like material, such as these Windows screen repair stickers. And just a reminder, if you do own a Cricut or a Silhouette cutting machine, you can use my digital templates, which you can find in my shop linked in the description box. Next, I cut these 2 frames and glued one to the top and the other to the bottom of the part I assembled earlier. To make the border of the tray, I cut these rectangles and glued them to the shorter sides of the base this way. Then I cut these 2 strips and I pressed them against a wet sponge to make them softer. I glued them to the longer sides of the tray, pressing them carefully to make sure that it followed the rounded corners. Next, I cut these parts and glued them along the edge of the tray, leaving out the central part on the shorter sides. Finally, I cut these tiny strips and glued them to the edge of the tray, aligned at the top. I coated the entire tray with acrylic gesso, which I realized might seem a bit silly since it was already white, but keep in mind that acrylic gesso is also a great way to strengthen a cardstock structure and make it more sturdy and durable. Next, I painted the tray in the same hue I used for the legs, and I'm not gonna lie, this was my favorite part of the entire project. I repeated the whole process to make 2 more trays, then I glued them to the legs this way. And I suggest using a couple of sewing pins to keep the trays in place while the glue dries, otherwise they might slip off. And yes, in case you were wondering, I am speaking from experience. Next, I took a few flathead jewelry pins and I glued them into the holes on the sides of the trays, as if they were tiny little screws. You can also use sewing pins for this. Finally, I coated the entire card with UV resin so that it would look a little more like enamel and less like, paper. And I'll have the resin linked in the description along with all the other supplies I used for this project in case you want to get it. Otherwise, you can use clear nail polish, it's just gonna take a little longer to dry. To make the wheels for a miniature, wait a second.
Råskog.
What she said, I started by cutting this little circle a few times, then I stacked all the layers together to get to a little disc that was roughly 2 mm in thickness. I topped it off with these little paper rings on both sides. Then I cut this part into metallic cardstock. I folded the sides along these lines. Then I painted the edges and the back side of the cardstock black. And by the way, you can often find metallic cardstock in food packaging, or at least that's where mine came from, but you can also buy it on Amazon and most craft stores. I assembled the wheel using another jewelry pin that I then trimmed and fixed in place with a drop of resin. And as you can see, the wheel rolls quite smoothly. I repeated this process to make 3 more tiny wheels, which I then attached to the card's legs this way. And this is all for today's video. As promised, here's a link to the free printable template, and if you're curious to see my very first attempt at making a miniature IKEA cart, and yes, this was way back in the Paleolithic, you should totally watch this video next. Have fun, and until next time, bye!